Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Online Prep Live with the ACT and Kaplan Test Prep. Tonight we have a special event for you guys, and it's our introduction to ACT's Kaplan's Online Prep Live program. So over the next 75 minutes or so, we're basically going to go through a sample class of what Online Prep Live is all about. And what we are all about here at Online Prep Live with the ACT and Kaplan is to helping you get a great score on your ACT, to get you ready for the ACT exam. And the reason that we take the ACT exam, of course, not for fun, but to take the ACT exam to show those colleges that we are ready for college level work. The ACT as a standardized test is basically designed as a way to measure how ready you are for college level work, and the better your score, the more successful that you are likely to be in college, in your first and even second year classes. So it's great to have you here, folks. My name is Arthur Ahn. I am an instructor with the Online Prep Live program. It's my pleasure to be with you all here. We've got a lot of people watching and participating in this class. If you are logged in via Facebook or Twitter, you can chat with us. You may see the chat window on the right side of the screen. Also want to give a shout out to those of you who may be watching over some other medium like YouTube, for instance. Wherever you are, it's the state of education now. We are in a digital age, and we're going to make things informative for you guys, but hopefully, just as importantly, fun for you guys as well. I know that when we teach these Online Prep Live classes, we try to make them interesting. We try to make them fun. We try to make them helpful for all of you guys. So Robert, how long is this session? It's going to be about 75 minutes long. And basically what we're going to cover in this session is basically to give you an overview of all 4 of the required ACT tests. So I saw from the poll results that we had at the very beginning, about 80% of you folks who are logged in right now, about 80% of you are taking the ACT this coming Saturday. Dun, dun, dun. Oh my gosh. We can be honest here, folks. We can be honest. If you're feeling a little nervous, if you're feeling a little anxious about the ACT, especially again, if you are taking it this coming Saturday, and especially for those of you who are taking the ACT and you've never really seen what the ACT is all about, well, glad that you're here because this session will give you a little snapshot into what to expect on the ACT. For those of you who have been studying, we'll learn a few handful of strategies and ways to analyze information in the best way possible to hopefully nudge your ACT score even higher. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention we've got an all-star crew of Kaplan ACT experts with us today. We've got Chris Calloway, we've got Stephanie Jolly, Joe Labate, Julia Taylor, and Nicole Bartlett are all here. They are all ACT experts. You can see them. They are interacting in the chat on the right side of the screen. Again, for those of you who are logged in. So please use that chat to ask any questions that you might have during the session. One of the nice things about this online session is that you don't have to kind of like wait for that moment when your teacher's when your teacher's pausing, like, I have a question, but I'm worried that my question's going to sound kind of stupid, and I don't want to ask this because I'm really nervous, so I'm not going to ask that question. No, I don't want you to think like that. Whatever questions that you might have, please post them into the chat, and we'll have one of our Kaplan ACT experts to answer any of your questions. And please also use that chat to interact directly with me as well, okay? And one thing I just want to point out is that we are using a moderated chat. So your comment, or like, for instance, if I ask a question and like 100 people put down yes, we may not open every single comment that comes through, but rest assured we see every single question that you guys ask, and we will answer every single question that you guys ask. So with that, here's what we're going to look at today. Basically, we're going to look at the 4 required sections of the ACT exam: the ACT English test, the ACT math test, the ACT reading test, and the ACT science test. And lastly, we'll take a look at what our ACT Kaplan Online Prep Live program is all about, okay? So with that, let's take a look at the first thing that we're going to look at here is just to focus a little bit on the English test. The English test will always come first. And if you notice here, the timing is actually quite tight. 45 minutes long and consists of 75 questions. Now go ahead and tell me in the chat. Go ahead and tell me. I use this chat interactively with you as well. Go ahead and tell me in the chat. What does that sound like in terms of timing? Like 45 minutes long, 75 questions. Keep it clean, guys. Keep it clean. But like what? But what does that actually kind of sound like in terms of timing? Does that sound like, oh, that sounds like plenty of time, no problems at all. I'm gonna get through this and get through this with no issues. I imagine a lot of people don't really think that, right? It seems like there are a lot of questions for such little time. 45 minutes long for 75 questions. Again, distributed over 5 passages. So that means you have about 9 minutes to spend on each passage, and it's 15 questions. Jot this down if you're taking notes. 9 minutes for each individual passage on the English test. Now, your timing may vary a little bit. So let's say you go through that first passage, and you're like, great, I got through this in like 7 minutes. Great. That means you have 2 extra minutes to play around with for the rest of that. 2 extra minutes to play around for the rest of that section. Or let's say the first passage, you answer that passage in 10 minutes. Well, that's okay. It's okay. But that means you're just going to have to speed up just things a little bit for those remaining passages. Remember, speed and accuracy are key. And in our online Prep Live program, we're able to go through all the common ways that you'll see English tested on the ACT. Now, the English test will contain passages on a variety of topics in a variety of different styles. So not every single question, is a grammar question, right? So that's the thing that you want to be careful of. If every single question was just a grammar question, then, for instance, Emmy, you mentioned like 0.6 seconds per question. It's not exactly that, but you can imagine, it'll be easier to get through, right? But some of those questions that you probably notice on the English test are actually a little bit longer. Like they ask you to revise or edit sentences, or to add sentences, or to delete a sentence, or things like that can come up. So even though there's a variety of topics and a variety of styles, don't worry. Your strategy stays the same regardless of the topic style. So don't get thrown off if you're seeing a passage and it's about a topic that you're not as interested in. The idea is that, look, don't worry about the topic itself. Look for, again, the grammatical mistakes. Look for the ways to make the sentences better without worrying about the actual topic itself. Now, some questions will ask about underlined portions, while others ask about a section of a passage, or maybe even the passage as a whole. And there are 3 recording categories. One is called conventions of standard English. Secondly, knowledge of language. And third, production of writing. And by the way, Leah, you asked a great question. How long are the passages? So in terms of the number of sentences or the number of paragraphs, that's not necessarily standardized, but every passage will have 15 questions. So Leah, does that help answer your question? 15 questions for each individual passage. That means the paragraphs probably somewhere from anywhere from 5 to 8 paragraphs maybe in a passage, approximately. But there's no set number of paragraphs within a passage. There's no set number of sentences in a passage. Okay. So, and again, in our online Prep Live program, we have detailed lessons for every category so that you don't have any surprises on test day. Again, this is just our sample class, so we're not able to go through. Obviously, we have tons and tons of different ways to look at these questions. But we're going to take a look at one example. That's a very common example, actually. So I saw that question before. We're going to get, is this lesson about general ideas, or we're going to talk about specifics? We're going to talk about 2 specifics on the English test. The first deals with commas in punctuation marks. Okay? Use commas to separate elements in a series or modifying elements. So for instance, whenever you have 3 different things in a list, notice how those 3 things are separated with commas. My most interesting classes this year are physics, calculus, and US history. Now, if you notice here, when you have 3 or more things, then you use a comma. But let me ask you this. If there were 2 things, would you need a comma? My most interesting classes this year are physics and math. Would you need a comma there? if you just had two things that were listed out. So this is important here. When you see a sentence listing out things, if there are only two things that are listed out, you actually do not need a comma. You wouldn't say like, my favorite snacks are cookies, comma, and ice cream. You could just say cookies and ice cream. But if you had said, my favorite desserts are cookies, comma, ice cream, comma, and potato chips, when you have three things being listed out, that's when you need commas for all of those. Okay? All right, so one example of using a comma. Secondly, use a comma with a coordinating conjunction to separate independent clauses. So if you notice here, we have a coordinating conjunction after the comma. And go and type into the chat if you see that one word here. That's the conjunction in this sentence. A conjunction is a word that connects two parts of a sentence together. Tell me if you notice, what is that conjunction in that sentence? I work on Mondays and I have soccer practice on Tuesdays. If you notice, we have this conjunction, the word and that word and has to have a comma before it. I work on Mondays, comma, and I have soccer practice on Tuesdays. So those would be when you have a coordinating conjunction to separate two independent clauses. Okay, and then thirdly, use a pair of commas. Use a pair of commas to add parenthetical or non-essential phrases and clauses. Like in the middle of a sentence, for instance, right? Like if you're adding on information that's actually not required or not necessary in the sentence itself, you can put a comma before and after that particular phrase. So as an example, Azara found, much to her delight, that the hours she spent studying were worth the efforts. Okay. All right, and Rachel, it's great to see that these are that coordinating. Rachel, is that coordinating conjunction the thing that you were referring to before? When we said you talked about this in your English class. In class before, so yeah, this stuff comes up again, not just on the ACT, but also in just your general English classes. So in this sentence here, this phrase in the middle, comma before and after, comma before and a comma after the non-essential information. Okay. And by the way, going back to that one question I saw before from BJ, is the Oxford comma still okay to use? Yes, absolutely. I'm glad you caught that, right? That Oxford comma is the comma that you use right before the word and when you're listing things out. Okay, when you're listing things out. All right. So with that, let's take a look then. Actually, so one more example of a phrase using commas, and that's when you have an introduction phrase. After school, Mindy has to go straight to band practice. Notice we have that phrase at the very beginning, after school, comma. So again, if you have some information that you're adding right at the very beginning, you separate that with a comma. All right, with that, take a look at the first question we have here. We have a poll at the bottom of the screen. That will get if you have an answer for this question. If you have an answer for this question, go ahead and click on the answer that you see at the bottom of, on the right side where it says poll. If you click on that tab that says poll, click on that, and you'll be able to see 4 answer choices. And go ahead and select the answer choice that you believe is correct. The greater the pressure from the wind causes bonds to form more quickly at the downward edge than in the rest of the snowflake. So notice here the underlined part, and this is one thing you always want to take note. So if you want to jot this down, whenever you see a comma that's underlined, right? If the comma is part of the underlined portion of the sentence, then just check to see, is that comma in the right place? Is that comma meant to be right there? Maybe the comma should be moved. Maybe the comma should be totally eliminated, right? So take a look at this sentence. The greater the pressure from the wind causes bonds to form more quickly at the downward edge than in the rest of the snowflake. Did something sound off there? Did something sound a little strange in that particular sentence? And if you notice here, it sounds a little bit odd when you have that comma right before the word causes. So even if you're not 100% sure how to fix this sentence, if you're saying to yourself, wait, Arthur, that sounded really weird. That sounded really awkward. Well, then in that case, at the very least, you know that you have to change something in that sentence, right? So therefore, we can eliminate choice A that says no change. So we're going to get rid of that choice altogether. Now, out of those remaining choices, see if you can spot the actual error, if you can spot the actual mistake here. So one thing that you might notice, that comma is definitely in the wrong place for one, right? That comma is definitely in the wrong spot. But here's the other thing. Do we even need that comma? The greater pressure from the wind causes bonds to form more quickly. Wait a minute. Do we even need any sort of comma there? And you're like, wait a minute. As about 72% of you put down, the correct answer is indeed choice D. We can get rid of the word the before the word pressure and just simply get rid of the comma. The greater pressure from the wind causes bonds to form more quickly at the downward edge than in the rest of the snowflake. And D is your correct answer. A lot of times, I think especially for even in as early as elementary school, when you learn a lot of grammar stuff, when it's like the first time you learn grammar, you might have had a teacher that says, oh, you know what, when in doubt, put a comma in there, put in some sort of break because you don't want to run on sentence. But that's kind of bad advice, because it's like, well, wait a minute, that means I should just put commas wherever possible, right? Choice D is your answer here, without any comma at all. The greater the pressure from the wind, causes bonds to form more quickly at the downward edge. And D is your answer. Great work on this one, folks. I got a majority of you guys to put in that correct answer. Over 900 of you voting. Again, you can always vote on questions by clicking on the poll on the right side of the screen. All right, let's take a look now at our second English topic, and that deals with subject-verb agreement. Okay, subject-verb agreement. So the subject and verb of a sentence must match in person. Subjects and verbs can use first person, right? I am is first person. Whereas second person, you are playing golf. Or third person, as in they are playing golf. So you have your first person, second person, and third person pronouns. Okay? So be careful which pronoun that you're using. Subjects can be singular or plural, so not just first person, second person, third person, but also whether it's singular or plural. She works really hard to improve her grades. That is singular. Whereas if you had they work really hard to improve their grades, that is going to be plural. Okay. All right, let's take a look at our second question here. Again, we're going to open up the poll for this one. So go ahead and click on the tab on the right side that says poll, and let's take a look at this question together. According to geologists, a fossil fuel deposit of truly game-changing size, whether a giant pocket of natural gas trapped within a shale formation or an enormous reservoir of crude oil deep behind the ocean waves, have become increasingly difficult to discover, if any even still exist. And by the way, this is a great example because, as Colton, you asked a few moments ago, can't you use hyphens for non-essential phrases too? And in fact, if you notice, this sentence has a couple of hyphens or dashes, really, right? So if you notice, wait a minute, all that stuff in the middle is actually not required. Grammatically speaking, we don't need any of that stuff in the middle in order to understand the sentence itself. And it's actually really helpful because if you notice the word have is a plural right, is a plural verb. But go ahead and type this into the chat for me, please. What is the subject of this sentence? What is the subject? Go ahead and type it in. I'll give you a few seconds. What is the subject of this sentence going to be? And if you notice, wait a minute, the subject of the sentence, and this is where you want to be careful. You just want to be careful. The subject is not geologists. The subject of the sentence is a fossil fuel deposit. Well, wait a minute. Deposit is singular. It's one thing. So wait a minute. Do the subject and verb agree with each other? They do not. So therefore, we can get rid of choice A. Right? We have to change something here. Now, what's the problem? What's the problem here? Now, notice we needed a plural. We needed a plural. Verb there. And we have two answer choices that are plural, or that can be used as plural. But here, if you notice, and I see the majority of you did put this down, about 85% of you have this. Yeah, what's the, instead of the plural version of have, we need the singular version, and the singular version is going to be answer choice C. According to geologists, a fossil fuel deposit of truly game-changing size has become increasingly difficult to discover, because that way now you have subject and verb agreement, and C is your answer. Great work on this one, folks. So we just covered a couple of the writing and of the English topics. You know, when you're reading a passage and you're asked to fix some of the writing errors, two big things to note. Punctuation marks, so for instance, commas, and we even saw an example of hyphens here, and also subject-verb agreement for nouns, for pronouns, for first person, second person, and third person. Okay? Great work here, folks. We're going to shift gears now and talk about the second part of the ACT exam, and that's the math test. The math test will always be the second test on the ACT. So the ACT is predictable in this way. The first will always be the English test. The second will always be the math test. Now, the math test is 60 minutes long and has 60 questions. Pop quiz, everybody. If you have 60 minutes to answer 60 questions, on average, how much time is that per question? If you have 60, if the math test is 60 minutes long and you have 60 questions, well, gee, 60 over 60, right? Absolutely. You have about 1 minute per question. Now, 1 minute per question does not mean that you answer every single question in just 1 minute. Some questions, let's be honest, some questions are going to take a little bit longer than 1 minute. Maybe you need 1.5 minutes. Maybe you need 2 minutes. And that's okay, as long as you can balance it out with topics that you feel more comfortable with. And those topics, I want you to still keep working on those, because that way, instead of spending like 1 minute on an algebra question, maybe you spend 45 seconds. Maybe you spend 40 seconds. Maybe you spend 30 seconds. That way, you bank time for those more difficult questions. So on average, it's going to be about 1 minute per question. But again, try to find the areas that you're good at and the areas that you still need to work on. And there are 8 reporting categories on the ACT math test. Preparing for higher mathematics, and those 5 subcategories: number and quantity, algebra, geometry, functions, statistics and probability, into essential skills. So basically, these are the ways that ACT math questions are categorized. We'll see a couple of examples here in this section dealing with the math test. And by the way, great question from Sahaj. Do the questions go from easy to hard? Now, generally, yes. But that doesn't mean it's going to be perfect for every single test taker, right? Like maybe there's a question type that you find easier that someone else might find more difficult. So it's not going to be perfect. Like number 1 is the easiest, number 60 is the most difficult. It's not going to be quite like that, but there is going to be a general trend where like the earlier questions are a little bit easier, the latter questions are a little bit more difficult. And by the way, as Sadie, you also asked, can you use a graphing calculator the whole time? Yes. So unlike that other standardized test, the SAT, the ACT has one math test, one section basically devoted to math, and you can use a calculator throughout the entire math section. Those of you who are familiar with the SAT has two math sections. One of them does not allow you to use a calculator, and one of them does. But on the ACT, you can always use the calculator. You can always use a calculator during the math test. Okay? So let's take a look at a couple examples of how math is applied on the ACT. And again, we're going to be using some of the lessons that we have from our online Prep Live program. Okay? The first, if you remember, under algebra, is the concept of quadratic equations. And we're going to kick this old school, everybody, by doing a refresher on how to create a quadratic equation by using that good old acronym of FOIL. Go ahead and type into the chat, when's the last time you used FOIL in high school? For some of you, maybe it was last week. For some of you, maybe it was last year. For some of you, it might have been 2 or 3 years ago. It's a lot, like, for a lot of people, this varies, right? But FOIL is like one of those classic, math concepts. I remember, like, when I think of like high school level math, like I always think of FOIL for some reason, right? It's that acronym that always sort of sticks there. FOIL refers to first, outer, inner, and last. You love FOIL. I love it. I'm loving the FOIL. Some of you guys saying you heard it today, you heard it yesterday, 10th grade, so maybe it's been a year or so. Philandra, yeah, it might have been a little bit a while ago there. And by the way, yes, any formulas you will need to memorize. You should be able to memorize some of those more basic formulas just so that you're clear about, okay, here's the information I'm given and here's what I'm trying to solve for. So use FOIL. So for instance, when we have this expression here, x plus 2 times x minus 3. Remember, how do we expand this? How do we multiply this out? We're going to use our acronym for FOIL by first multiplying the first terms. The first terms, the x and the x, give us the x squared. So that's the first thing. Then the outer terms, and in this case, the outer terms are going to be x and -3. So that will give us x and -3, and then the inner terms, 2 and x together, that will give us -x. And then finally, the last terms. The last terms will be the +2 and the -3, and that'll give us -6. So again, old school stuff for some of you guys, right? About FOIL here, multiplying out those terms. FOIL, if you really think about it, is kind of like the distributive property in math, right? Remember the distributive properties when you take something on the outside and multiply everything on the inside? So FOIL is kind of like the distributive property. You multiply the outside by the inside. So first, outer, inner, and last. That's how we set up. FOIL. And by the way, Samara, yeah, I've seen that a lot of people use the box technique, and that's perfectly fine too. Hey, whatever makes you get the questions right faster, right? That's the important thing. Whatever helps you answer those questions as quickly as possible. Now, what if you want to do the reverse, right? The reverse, to factor quadratic. Well, to factor quadratic, you use reverse FOIL. So let's say that's something like this. X squared plus 5x plus 6 is equal to 0. And you want to factor this. Well, the first thing you do is this. Well, what two things, and go ahead and tell me in the chat, what two things, and this is not a trick question, what two things do you multiply together to get x squared? What two things, if you multiplied them together, would get you x squared? If you're thinking, Arthur, wait, really? X squared? Isn't that just x and x? Yeah, you're right. It is just x and x. So we just fill in the x in the first parentheses and the x in the second parentheses. That's the easy part, right? When we have x squared at the beginning, we just fill in the x and the x. Now, the other part, though. When you're trying to figure out, okay, what are the other numbers that go in there? What are those other numbers we're going there? And I see a couple folks like Ethan mentioning x plus 2 times x plus 3. Here's the quick way to know what numbers to put in. You think of the two numbers that multiply together to give you the last number and add together to get the middle number. The two numbers that multiply together to give you the last number and add together to give you the middle number, and in this case, indeed, the two numbers are going to be positive 2 and positive 3. So we literally fill in positive 2 and positive 3, and there's our reverse FOIL. So that's how you factor a quadratic equation. All right, we're going to open up the poll for question number 3. Again, you can access the poll on the right side of the screen. You should see two tabs there, one that says chat and one that says poll. Click on the tab that says poll, and then you should see 5 answer choices. One important thing to remember is that on the math test, there are always going to be 5 answer choices for math questions. On all the other ACT tests, like the English test and the reading test and the science test, there's always 4 answer choices. But in the math, there's always going to be 5 answer choices. Take a look at number 3. What is the sum of the two solutions for x in the quadratic equation x squared plus x minus 56 is equal to 0? So here's the equation that we're actually given. X squared plus x minus 56 is equal to 0. So first thing you always want to say is, well, make sure it's set equal to 0. And in this case, it already is, right? So when we set this equal to 0, how do we find what x is, right? Because the question is asking for the sum of the two solutions for x. Well, that means we need to know what x is. And this is where, again, we're going to break out that the old school factoring. So we're going to take that equation, x squared plus x minus 56 is equal to 0. And then we're going to factor this. So set up our two parentheses there. Our two parentheses there. Now the first part is easier, right? The x squared. And again, that's still going to be x and x. So you can actually just set up 2 different parentheses there. And then the other thing to ask yourself is this. What 2 numbers, and go ahead and type this into the chat, what 2 numbers multiply together to get negative 56 and add together to get positive 1? What are those 2 numbers going to be? What are those 2 numbers going to be? And indeed, it's going to be 8 and negative 7, right? Positive 8 and negative 7 will add to 1. Positive 8 and negative 7 will multiply to 56. So there's our format. X minus 7 times x plus 8 is equal to 0. But hold on here for a second. Hold on here. Because the question is not asking us for just the factored format. It's asking us for the sum of the 2 solutions for x. So now that we have this, well, let me ask you this. I mentioned this before, that it's so important to make sure that equation is set equal to 0. And here's why. Type this into the chat for me, please. When you're multiplying 2 things together and the result is 0, what has to be true about those 2 things? If you're multiplying 2 things together and you multiply 2 things together and the result is equal to 0. So we see that in this example right here. 2 things are being multiplied, the result is 0. What has to be true about one of these 2 things? If you think about the way multiplication works and you get a result of 0, well, guess what? That means one of these 2 things must equal 0. So either the x minus 7 is going to be equal to 0, or the x plus 8 is going to be equal to 0. So if x minus 7 is equal to 0, what's x? And if x plus 8 is equal to 0, what's x? So those 2 are going to be positive 7 and negative 8. But we're not done yet, because the question is asking us for our final step, the sum of these two solutions? Well, the two solutions we have are positive 7 and negative 8. And what are we going to do with these two numbers? We're going to add them together. 7 plus negative 8 is going to be equal to negative 1. And there's your answer. Choice C, negative 1 is your correct answer for this. Be careful. I saw a lot of people put down positive 1 because at first it makes sense that it's positive 1 because you probably saw the negative 7 and the positive 8. Remember, those two things give you the factored form, but you need what x is equal to, so you set those two factors equal to 0, and then you solve for those two factors. Okay. I know it's a little bit of a tougher question, but let's take a look at another higher difficulty topic, and this deals with geometry and specifically dealing with triangles. So triangles are a very popular figure on the ACT math test. You'll see out of the geometry questions, a lot of, like a whole bunch of them will deal specifically with triangles. So there are a couple things that we want to remember about triangles. Okay, first, the angles of a triangle always add up to 180 degrees. It always, always, always adds up to 180 degrees. If it does not add up to 180 degrees, guess what? It's not a triangle. It's some other weird shape. The area formula of a triangle can be found by multiplying the base and the height before dividing by 2. Or if you remember the fancy formula, the area of a triangle is 1/2 times the base times the height. And yes, this formula is one that you'll need to remember for test day. Now, for all right triangles, by the way, if you're taking notes, and certainly want to encourage you guys to be taking notes as well if you're not, if you are, but for all right triangles, you have this good old Pythagorean theorem, and those of you who have taken high school geometry, you're probably looking at this like, oh my gosh, I see this all the time. I see this stinking equation all the time when I'm looking at right triangles. It never goes away. And because it's so important, to be honest, it's really important to make sure that you have the Pythagorean theorem, because it's so relevant because it's specifically talking about the relationship of sides of a right triangle. The Pythagorean theorem states a squared plus b squared is equal to c squared. A and b are the legs of the triangle. C is what's called the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is always the longest side of the right triangle. And particularly the Pythagorean theorem, always be on the lookout for right triangles that follow certain ratios. 3, 4, 5, 5, 12, 13, special right triangles. So as an example, like if the ACT gave you a right triangle and they said like, oh, this side is 6 and this side is 8, and then what is this side equal to? You could use the Pythagorean theorem. You could use the Pythagorean theorem. 6 squared plus 8 squared equals c squared. You could solve that. But do you notice the pattern here that's being followed in this triangle where the two sides are 6 and 8? There's a quick shortcut to figure out what c is equal to in this right triangle. And if you're careful, if you notice, wait a minute, 6 and 8 are double of the 3 and 4. So then that missing side also is going to be double. So then you don't have to do all the math there. You know that C is simply going to be equal to 10. Again, just a quick shortcut there in terms of just being able to solve for the sides of a right triangle a little bit quicker. Okay, Jacob, yeah, this formula comes up a lot, right? Like, you're right, the night before geometry test, I'm sure this equation is like bouncing around in your brain, right? It's just like going bloop, 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 like inside your brain, trying to memorize that equation as you're going. Okay, all right. So that's right triangles. Let's take a look though at an example of just a triangle here. The question's asking for the degree measure of the smallest interior angle of triangle DEF shown below. Okay. So notice in this triangle they give us these three angles. One of them is x plus 2. One of them is 4x plus 16. One of them is 2x plus 5. So we said this before, right? In a triangle, three angles in a triangle always add up to 180 degrees. So we want to, and to be clear, we want to write this out just so that we don't lose track of our math steps. So yes, there are, Tamir, you asked, are there points off for not showing work? Well, guess what? The ACT actually doesn't care how you solve the question. The ACT just cares, did you get it right? So you don't have to show all your work. You don't have to write it out all nice and neat. It's like you can just, use your scratch paper to just jot down important things to set up equations. The main thing is this: I don't want you to do the math in your head. Like, I don't want you to do the math in your head, because that's where we can get mistakes, right? That's how we can make mistakes here. But here, if we notice, wait, these three angles are given to us, and three angles always add up to 180 degrees. So we can set up an algebraic equation. The first angle, x plus 2. The second angle, 2x plus 15. And the third angle, 4x plus 16, is equal to 180 degrees. Okay? And now, if you remember our old school algebra skills here, we're going to combine the like terms here. We have x, we have 2x, we have 4x. So that's going to give us 7x. And then we have the numbers here, right? 2, 15, and 16. If we combine those like terms, we're going to have 33. So we have 7x plus 33 is equal to 180. And then when we subtract 33 on both sides, we have 7x is equal to 147. And again, please use the calculator for this. I don't want you to be breaking out long division on your scrap paper. 147 divided by 7. Don't want you to do that. Break out your calculator at this point. But okay, if 7x is equal to 147, to know what x is, we're going to divide both sides by 7. And x is going to be equal to 21. Here's the thing, though. Are we done? Is that what this question is asking us for? Is this question asking us for the value of x? It's not. It's asking us for the smallest interior angle. So here's the thing I want you to notice. A lot of people at this point would say, oh, I know x is equal to 21. So let me plug 21 into all three of those angles, right? So that way I can compare, right? I can see, oh, which of those three angles is the smallest, and then that's the one I'm put down for my answer. But look at the three angles we have here. One of them says x plus 2. One of them says 2x plus 15. And one of them says 4x plus 16. Without doing the math here, go ahead and type this into the chat. Which of those three angles is going to be the smallest? Is it going to be angle D, angle E, or angle F? Which of those three angles is going to be the smallest interior angle? And if you're looking at, if you look at those variables, for instance, notice how angle E just has x, whereas angle D has 4x plus something. And then F has 2x plus something. So yeah, Michael, I love the way you phrase that. E is obviously smaller, just logically. So here's the thing. Are you going to solve for those other two angles? If the question's just asking us for the smallest interior angle, we don't care about angle D. We don't care about angle F. We just care about angle E. So we know x is equal to 21. The smallest angle is x plus 2. Hardest part of the question, guys. What's 21 plus 2 equal to? And that's going to be 23, and that's going to give us choice B, or boom, 23 is your correct answer for this one. Great work on this question, folks. I love that note there that Michael, that you said before. Like, since we see the one that's obviously the smallest, and the question's asking us for the smallest one, well, then that's the only one we care about. We're not going to do any more work than we have to for any of these ACT math questions. It's going to save us time. It's also going to save us a lot of mental energy. All right, so that's a review, a quick review of the math, of some of the math topics that you'll see on the ACT math test. Let's take a look at the next test on the ACT, and that's the ACT reading test, which is always third, right after the break. So you'll have the first two tests, the English test and the math test, and then after a break, then you'll have the reading test. The reading test will be 35 minutes long and consist of 40 questions distributed over 4 passages. So here's where you want to be careful. 4 passages, 35 minutes long. That gives you just under 9 minutes for each passage and the 10 questions. Now, if you say, well, wait a minute, that sounds like I'm going to have to read really fast. And yeah, that's part of it. Read efficiently, read aggressively. But also, just the main thing is this. When we talk about reading aggressively, sometimes for a lot of people, that means, okay, I'm going to read this over and over and over again as quick as possible. I'm going to shake my head like this the whole time. I'm just going to read everything and try to memorize everything. That's not aggressive reading. That's not efficient reading. That's reading for memorization. Right? Like when you're like, you picture yourself like, if you're taking like a history test at school and it's like 5 minutes before the test and you're hanging outside the classroom and you're like reading your notes and you're trying to like memorize everything like one last time. That's not the way you should treat the ACT reading test. Because the ACT reading test, well, let me ask you this. Do you have to memorize the passages at all when you're reading during the ACT? Do you actually have to memorize the passages? Well, no, right? Like, because they're in the booklet. They stay there. No one's going to take the booklet away from you and say, okay, now answer the questions. Ha, ha, ha. Like, no one's going to do that. So you don't read for memorization. You read efficiently. You read quickly and you read efficiently, but don't sit there and try to memorize every single detail. So the technique that we're going to practice together here is called passage mapping, about basically kind of finding the summary of each individual paragraph. That's what that's going to be a key to success for you on the ACT reading test. So the reading test will contain passages in these 4 categories: social studies, humanities, natural sciences, and literary narrative. So 4 different categories that you'll see there. And again, no matter what the passage type is, you will use the same reading techniques throughout. Okay. And by the way, Sahaj, you said underline helps when you're reading, and I would agree with that generally. The one thing to be careful of, though, is that if you start underlining a lot of things, and I don't know, I used to do this a lot, like if I was like reading something for school and I would like underline, oh, this looks important, 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 oh, this looks important, this really looks important, this looks important. Then what happens? I've underlined like everything, right? And if you underline everything, you're saying everything's important, which kind of means nothing's important, or nothing's more important than anything else. So if you are going to underline stuff, I would say just be careful that you're not underlining too much. Does that make sense? Let us know if you need any further clarification. And let's just ask a great question also. Should you read the questions first? Now, I'm going to be really honest with you guys. If the ACT reading passages only had like 1 or 2 questions afterward, I would say yes, absolutely. Read the questions first, because that way you're only focusing on 2 things. But remember, how many reading questions are there for each passage? There are going to be about 10 questions for every reading passage. So it's too much on your brain to read all of the questions first and then try to answer them. And remember, some of those questions are going to be like, what's the main idea? Which means you have to kind of read the whole passage anyway. So we always say, read the whole passage first, make quick summaries as you're reading, and then tackle the questions. Does that help there a little bit? So again, always read the passage first rather than reading the questions first. Okay. So with that in mind, just a couple other things to know about ACT reading. Again, the main point is this. Determine the author's main idea, find and interpret important ideas, and make inferences based on written text. Okay? And lastly, to analyze the author's voice and analyze what the author is doing within the passage. We'll take a look at an example of a passage that you would see in our online Prep Live class. Again, all the material that you're looking at here tonight is coming from our full program. So it's just a small sample of actual questions from the ACT online Prep Live. All right, so one big thing here about about making inferences. Big picture versus finer points. Reading on the ACT, and in fact, just in general, reading in college, requires you to take a whole bunch of words and sentences and say, okay, what's the main point of this? What's the main thing that's being brought up here? That's ultimately the skill of reading well, not just on the ACT, but even in college. And if you can note, again, like things like the topic or the purpose or the main idea while you're reading, you'll be prepared to answer these questions. Now, it's also important to make inferences that are not explicitly stated in the passage. So I'll give you an example of making an inference, okay? Let's say I were to tell you, I live in New York City and I have a very small apartment, but if I tell you I live in New York City, and in my New York City apartment, I have 5 cats, and I feed my cats really well. I make sure to clean out the litter box every day. I give them fresh water. I've knitted them little cat sweaters when it gets really cold out. I get them nice little cat treats and cat toys and things like that. What's a reasonable inference you can make? And keep it clean, guys. Keep it clean. But what's a reasonable inference you can make based on that information that I just gave you? That I keep 5 cats in my apartment in New York City, and I clean out their litter box, and I try to give them the very best cat food possible, and I brush their hair every night before they go to sleep or before I go to sleep. Well, the reasonable inference you can make here is like, oh, Arthur likes cats. Arthur's a cat person. Arthur cares about his cats. Arthur loves cats, right? That would be a reasonable inference. Now, maybe a not quite reasonable inference, Holden, that I'm a lonely guy. I don't blame you if that's the first thought you had. But the inference we can make here from this information is that, yeah, Arthur cares for his cats. Now, did I explicitly say that? Did I explicitly say, I care about my 5 cats, and let me tell you how I care about my 5 cats? I didn't say that. I didn't have to say that. You were able to make the inference. So even though an inference is not explicitly stated in a passage, based on the information that's given, what conclusion can you make from that? How can you connect the dots in the passage to come up with an inference? So let's take a look at this first example here, dealing with this passage about handedness in vertebrates. And it's a long paragraph, a lot of information here. But we take a look at this paragraph. I'm going to read this, and again, as we read this, see if you can distill it down to just the one main point, 1 or 2 main points. I saw that note earlier about, like, should we annotate this? And we're actually going to show you some good ways to annotate this sort of passage. But go ahead and type it in chat as I'm reading, if you notice what's the main point here. In the past, scientific consensus was that the separation of functions within the brain, each hemisphere is responsible for certain tasks, but communicating with each other for others was a uniquely human trait. About 90% of all humans are right-handed, implying that the dominant hemisphere for most humans' motor functions is the left side. I'm going to stop right here, actually, just even midway through this first paragraph. If you notice the big theme that's coming up here, they're talking about, like, the way the brain kind of, like, interprets depending on whether you're, like, right-handed. So if you want to make a quick annotated note here, right? If you see, like, in the past, they felt this, well, they're bringing up a theory. And what's that theory? It's that humans are left-brained and they're right-handed. And then as we go on from there, let's take a look at how this paragraph ends. Researchers have observed this tendency at all stages of life, even prior to birth. Clearly, there is some kind of genetic predisposition involving the separation of the hemispheres of the brain. One may ask whether this separation is found similarly in all animals. So towards the end, they're bringing up, oh, this is something we notice in humans. Maybe this also happens in animals as well. So if you see, we kept our annotations very short and simple. Humans are left-brained and right-handed, like most, right? More than 90% of all humans are right-handed. Okay, so it makes it sound like, yeah, the vast majority of people are right-handed, so they're left-brained. And now we're going to see whether this separation is found in all animals, not just human beings. Let's take a look at that. The second paragraph. The evidence that a left-brained, right-handed preference for everyday activities occurs in nearly all vertebrates is mounting and substantiates the notion of a genetic component to the differentiation of the brain hemispheres. Okay, so in the first sentence, it's starting off by saying, yeah, you know what? This preference is mounting, right? Like, okay, it seems like other animals are also tend to be very like left-brained, right-handed, right? Like very much right-handed. It seems like a lot of animals are like that. But if you notice here, and go and type in chat if you notice, the transitional word at the beginning of the next sentence, what sort of transition is the word however going to bring up? If you have a first sentence and then the next sentence starts with the word however, what do you already know is going to come up? You know the next part, yeah, but hold on a second. Yeah, but, like, we're going to bring up some contrast, some difference. Let's see what that difference is. However, no animal has shown as extreme a preference as humans. And I love what you said there, Shannon, that humans are far more predisposed to left-brainedness than animals. Good, far more, right? Some animals are, but humans are much more so. Let's go on from there. This disparity is probably due to a combination of factors. Most likely the use of tools and the continued reliance on fine motor skills for the everyday tasks of humans forced the right-handed preference to become increasingly favored. Oh, they're telling us now why humans are much more left-brained than other animals, like their tools and relying on motor skills. Genetics may have started humans on the path to left-brain dominance, but other factors must have been important to produce the extreme bias that we see in human beings today, on human brains today. So again, if you notice here, left brain, right-handedness is everywhere, but how come humans have it most of all? More than genes. It's not just the genes, it's like that everyday stuff that they brought up towards the second part of that paragraph. That was the conflicting information. That was the contrast. That was, again, the use of that word however there. Nicely done. So again, our summary here, we have some evidence that animals are also more left-brained, but humans are much more so, not just because of genes, but because of like outside factors, like tools, for instance. All right, with that, let's take a look at a couple of questions. We're going to open the poll. Go ahead and click on the poll tab on the right side of your screen to answer question number 5. The main point of the passage is to do what? What is the main point of this passage? Well, let's think about what we just read here. Again, keep it general. A lot of people, when they see this question on test day, they're going to try to reread the passage. And let's face it, I know this one's old, guys. I know this meme is old, but ain't nobody got time for that, right? We don't have time to read the passage again, right? We're just going to kind of think, okay, what were the major things that came up? Oh, they were talking about like the brain, like the human brain, and like whether it's left-brained or right-brained. Like if you're right-handed, that means the left brain has those motor skills. Which of those choices is going to give you that response? And your correct answer here is indeed choice B. The specialization of the hemispheres of the brain has a complex origin. So they're talking about, again, like all that stuff about like the origin, the genetics, and all that stuff. Nicely done. And now let's take a look at question number 6. It can be inferred from the passage that no species has ever displayed what? Take a look at those choices and see if you can find an answer. Go and put your answer into the poll. We want the inference that no species has ever displayed. Well, let's think about what the passage said. The passage said human beings are really, really right-handed, right? They're really left-brained. Other animals are too, but human beings are really right-handed. Well, if you take a look at those choices, if you see the inference there, which of those choices talks about how we see, again, the preference, the strength, the leaning towards people being right-handed? Well, no species has ever displayed a 95% preference. And why? Because if you remember from that passage, human beings have a 90% preference, and human beings have the strongest preference. So no animal or nothing else is going to have a higher than 90%. That's why choice B is your correct answer. Great work on this passage, everybody. Nicely done. By the way, for those two questions that you guys got 90% or more correct, I am going to give out a big old gold star for your excellent efforts for that question. I actually like to give out, I don't call it the gold star, I call it the Mario Brothers star. It's me, a Mario. Like, grab that gold star, and that will give you 15 seconds of ACT invincibility, so you can knock out the Goombas and the Koopa Troopers and the Bullet Bobs, and all those nasty enemies in Mario Brothers. I'm really old school. I still love playing Mario Brothers. All right, that's our review on the ACT reading test, and we got one more test to look at. And that's the ACT science test. And by the way, great question came in earlier about the writing test. Since the writing test is optional, we won't cover it tonight, but one thing you'll remember, the ACT writing test is optional. That's the essay portion of the exam. It is optional. It counts separately from your ACT score from 1 to 36, but it is separate, and we won't cover that one tonight just because, again, it's optional. But we will wrap up with the science test, which will always be the fourth test on the ACT. 35 minutes long, 40 questions over 7 passages. So that means you have about 5 minutes to spend on each individual passage. I know Mario Brothers seems kind of old, but you guys probably play like Mario Kart, right? Or Super Smash Brothers, or some of those other Mario games. I love Mario Kart, right? The most terrifying sound in Mario Kart is when you're in first place and you're driving the car, and then you hear someone throw the turtle shell, and you're just like, oh boy, I'm going to get knocked out now. Anyway, if you have that gold star with you, you will not get knocked out. All right, let's take a look at the ACT science test. In this ACT science test, we'll test you on passages about typical science topics. You know, things like biology and chemistry and earth science, space science, physics. So again, very typical scientific stuff, right? Now, here's the great thing though about the ACT science test. You actually don't need any like higher level sciencey information, because even though the topics are about science, about like chemistry or physics or things like that, they'll give you all the information. Sometimes people actually think about it, feels almost like reading comprehension, but with like a twist of science. And that is actually the way I like to think of it sometimes, right? They may give you like information about an experiment, and your idea is to read the chart, read the table, read the graph, and to understand what is given in this experiment and what information do we know from this experiment, and what information can we figure out from this experiment. So really it's more about like things like the scientific method, right? Like, you know, things like, for instance, just applying scientific reasoning. We'll see a couple of examples of that, like different variables, right? You have the independent and the dependent variable, or like the control of an experiment. You might remember this stuff even from like 9th grade or even like 8th grade science classes, right? So it's kind of more about that kind of stuff, like just taking the mind of a scientist and saying, okay, I have this information, what can I figure out? So for instance, you'll see questions that deal with variables of a chart or a graph, and what you want to always note, the x-axis usually depicts the independent variable. So for instance, sometimes like, like time might be an example of an independent variable, right? Time is going to change on its own. The y-axis usually shows the dependent variable. So as time increases, there is more mold on the bread, right? Like something gross like that, right? You've seen it, right? When there's mold on the bread, you probably shouldn't eat it, just to be clear. But you know, that's an example of like independent and dependent variable, right? The x-axis is usually the independent variable, the y-axis is usually the dependent variable, and the graph is showing some relationship from x to y. Also, note the units. What does each tick mark represent? Sometimes it's seconds, sometimes it's minutes, sometimes it's hours, depending on the experiment itself. And then lastly, the general trend. The general trend. Like, don't sit there and try to memorize the numbers, because that's going to be a big waste of time. But instead, Oh, I noticed like as time increases, this is also increasing. Or as this goes up, something goes down. So just think in those terms, like, oh, is something going up or something going down? Is there a direct relationship or is there an inverse relationship between those variables? What would the graph look like beyond the view that's being shown? So here's an example of a science question on the ACT. Notice they're starting off with this information at the beginning, and really, honestly, you can kind of skim this information because the information that's there will almost always be in the graph or in the chart or in the table. Solid materials were examined for their maximum solubility levels in water at various temperatures. Figure 1 shows the grams of solute for various chemical compounds in a saturated solution with 100 grams of H2O. And again, if you're like, oh my gosh, Arthur, I hate chemistry. Oh my gosh, those weird letters and numbers all together, KNO3, NaNO3, NABr, KBr. Don't worry about that stuff. Don't worry about that stuff. You're not going to get a question that says, what does KBr stand for? What does NaNO3 stand for? They will not give you questions like that. Your job is to take the information in that scientific graph or chart and be able to interpret it. So notice the two variables that we have here. On the x-axis, we've got temperature. On the y-axis, we've got solubility. And note the unit there regarding solubility. Temperature is in Celsius. Solubility is per 100 grams of H2O. Right? So out of 100 grams of water. And go ahead and type this in. What's the general trend that you notice between these two variables? As temperature is changing, as temperature is increasing, right? Because notice, temperature is increasing when we go from left to right. What do you notice is the general trend of the solubility? What do you notice is that general trend of the solubility? And most of those are actually increasing. As temperature increases, solubility is increasing for most of them. Not all of them, but for most of them, right? If you notice, there are two that actually go downward a little bit. The NaSO4, the Na2SO4, and the Ce2SO4 too also goes down. But for the most part, it's pretty positive. For the most part, it goes upward. All right, let's take a look at number 7. Approximately how many grams of NaNO3 could be dissolved in 25 grams of H2O at 90 degrees Celsius? Wait a minute. Sounds pretty straightforward at first. Go ahead and click on the answer that you believe is correct for this one on the poll on the right side of your screen there. Well, they're asking us about NaNO3, so that's right here. That's the only one we're going to care about for this question. Don't even worry about any of those other lines. So that line for NaNO3. And they say, oh, 90 degrees. Well, we don't see 90 degrees marked off, but 90 degrees would be sort of like right in the middle between 80 and 100. So if we draw sort of like a line going straight up to the top here, oh, look at that. At 90 degrees, the solubility of NaNO3 in this chart is 160. And we see 160 as one of the answer choices. But be careful. Look at what the question is saying here. It's asking us how many grams could be dissolved in 25 grams of H2O. What is the solubility unit of measurement in this chart? It says out of 100 grams of H2O. So out of 100 grams, it would be solubility of 160. But since the question's asking for 25 grams, it's going to be 1/4 of that. And that's going to lead us to answer choice B, 40 grams as your correct answer. So that last step is basically to divide by 4 to give you 40. So a lot of people put down 160 because at first it looks so straightforward, but there was that little ACT twist there, right? This question was asking for 25 grams. The chart gives us 100 grams. So how do we go from 100 to 25? Divide by 4, and that'll be your answer. Great work on this question, folks. Great work overall tonight. We've covered a lot of different topics here about the ACT, and hopefully this has been really helpful for you guys to understand the format, the content, the difficulty levels of the ACT exams. Now again, what you saw here tonight was a little snapshot of ACT Kaplan's Online Prep Live program. It's an exclusive partnership that we have with the ACT and Kaplan Test Prep. Now, with this program, if you're interested in signing up for this program, you get access to official ACT practice questions. These are questions created from the ACT from previous exams. You'll get live classes like this one that you're watching tonight. You'll also get on-demand classes that you can access at any time that you like. You also have personalized study plans available for you. You also have Kaplan's best and brightest ACT experts. And me, they let me do this too. But honestly, I mean, you see a lot of those great Kaplan folks in the chat, Chris and Joe and Julia and Nicole and Stephanie. You see all those great folks there. These are some of our very best and brightest ACT teachers that we have at Kaplan. They are all part of the Online Prep Live program. And if you qualify for a fee waiver when you're taking the ACT, you can actually get our program also for free as well. Okay. Now, our ACT program has over 2,400 practice questions, lots of extra practice tests, 2 full-length tests and 4 short-form tests, and we have online sessions that will go over official ACT practice tests, as well as 450 digital flashcards from the ACT, 28 hours of unique instruction. You don't have to go through every single one of those 28 hours, just to be clear. The idea is that the program is customizable depending on what you need to work on the most, okay? And we have live classes that fit around your schedule. We have on-demand recordings that are available anytime at all. We also have discussion boards through our online. So if you're a student with Kaplan's Online Prep Live program, you get access to email and message boards to reach out to fellow students and to reach out to our Kaplan ACT experts. And again, you also get study plans that tell you what you need to work on, and what you need, and what you're good at right now, and what else you need to work on. Again, your recommendations are based purely on your own performance. It's completely personalized for you. Okay, and you can take Online Prep Live on the go. Again, we have on-camera and off-camera teachers that are going to help you out for every single live session. Okay, so how to access Online Prep Live? It is available when you register for the ACT, also available even before you register for the ACT. Now, if you're already registered for the ACT and you're interested in our program of Online Prep Live, you can sign up for Online Prep Live without registering for a new test. Now, if you have the Online Prep program, you can upgrade to Online Prep Live. That'll get you access to more practice questions and all of these live online lessons. Now, the cost of these, you see those costs there. A 6-week subscription costs $99.95. Now, a 12-week subscription usually costs $180. But if you use code EVENTS when you're signing up for the course, you'll get a 20% discount on a 12-week subscription. 12 weeks is basically about, what, 3 months? So for those of you who might be thinking about taking like the test this coming Saturday and maybe thinking about taking the next exam as well, the 12-week option might be the best for you. That way you get access to all of these materials for both of those exams. And maybe you're going to take the ACT not just this coming Saturday, or maybe you're going to take it next winter or even next spring. You may want to consider the 24-week subscription. Again, normally it's $249.95, but again, you can get a 25% discount if you use the code EVENTS. And I'll give you a nice little discount here so that you can study for the ACT multiple times to get you ready for that great score that you're looking for on testing. So again, Online Prep Live is on sale now. You can click on the Order Now button that's directly below to go directly to the ACT website to sign up for Online Prep Live. Again, use that code EVENT when you're signing up for the Online Prep Live classes. And again, if you're already registered for Online Prep Live, well, you can log in and get access to all of your materials available. And with that, that wraps up our Online Prep Live session. I hope you guys had a little bit of fun here tonight. We try to make our sessions as enjoyable and as engaging as possible. For not just I mean, I'm literally just talking to my laptop right now, but it's always great when you see so many great questions come in and so many great comments coming in. So thank you all for your participation. Again, hope this was helpful. Take advantage of Online Prep Live. Those of you who are taking the ACT this coming Saturday, I want to wish you all the best of luck as you continue to study for the ACT on the road to a great score and college admissions. But again, consider signing up for Online Prep Live to get you even more and more help to help you get to that amazing score that you're looking for on test day. On behalf of everyone here at Kaplan tonight and at Online Prep Live, my name is Arthur. It's been my pleasure to be with y'all. Have a wonderful rest of your night. And again, wish you all the best of luck as you continue to study for the ACT. Take care. Have a great night, everybody. Bye.